The fuck did you just say, Seth?
We don't care what you look like. We don't care who you voted for, who you worship, who you love. If you want rule, there's one thing I can promise you, so help me God. Someone else will raise your sons and daughters.
Today we have a very special episode. We are interviewing Patrick, who is a contributor to the book Organizing for Autonomy, History, Theory, and Strategy for Collective Liberation. It was published by Common Notions, and the organization that wrote the book was CounterPower. Patrick has been with CounterPower for quite some time, if I'm not mistaken. But Patrick, tell us about yourself.
Hey, what's up, y'all? Thank you for having me on the podcast and for taking interest in CounterPower's latest and first book. It's been a journey to this point. I am. My name's Patrick. I use he/him pronouns. I am in the U.S. South, and I'm a public school teacher. I teach social studies and history, and I'm involved in the teachers movement down here through a rank and file opposition caucus in my teachers union. And that's sort of the main mass work, as we call it, that I do.
Damn, that's pretty cool. Do you run into issues being a history teacher with your political work and like alignment and stuff, or?
None yet. None yet, but education is an interesting terrain right now, both because, the recent wave of teacher strikes that wasn't that long ago from, the West Virginia teacher strike being the most notable, but also the Chicago Teachers Union, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, and their work inside the Chicago Teachers Union has changed the terrain of the classroom struggle as well, right? And and also the uprising, the Black Liberation Uprising has also shifted the conversation in public education, and at least from what I've seen has created more space for discussions of settler colonialism, U.S. imperialism among history educators, for example. So you're having it's an interesting world right now, right? You have teachers fighting back against being forced to in-person instruction. You have, before that, a lot of teacher militancy around school funding and healthcare and teachers' wages and things like that. And there's struggle around curriculum and especially for history, whose history are we teaching? Mm-hmm. What is history? So
so there's no wink winks to push your students leftward,
Oh, well, I mean, I'm all about critical pedagogy and I think that what we want to be doing is developing, our students' thinking capacities and to assess material for themselves, right? And it can be hard sometimes in the context of state mandated curriculum that is designed to uphold and reinforce the U.S. imperial state, but at the same time, I think good educators can find ways to teach lame content in a more exciting and critical fashion, and to develop understandings in the classroom around things like class struggle and the roots of this settler colonial empire. So,
yeah, I would say that struggle, education, and history, all of these are, it's fitting that you're a teacher because all of these are so prevalent in the book. I read it, I think I read it through 2.5, 3 times before this episode. And it's a very even Anthony was talking to me about how much he enjoyed it. It's a very laid out blueprint, I would say. It's a very good fast track to knowing what is the goal of the imperial American two-party system, how to like subvert that, not just through electoral politics but through organization. And I know you've worked with the Richmond Tenants Union, and yeah, I think that the immediately one of the things that struck me about the book was the mention of the I think it was the BRU, the Bus Riders Union. Yeah. So with that said, what is the goal society that's described in this book? And is it communism or is it something else?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to push back about the classification as a blueprint, because I think, like a blueprint. What is a blueprint? Like a blueprint's what an architect produces for like a building that's constructed, and there's like very rigid specifications. And for like good architecture and for like a stable building, it's very important that there are rigid specifications, right? You don't want the roof collapsing on you or the floor falling out from underneath you. But like revolutionary politics has to be much more flexible. So I think we would prefer like concepts like framework, or even like a platform, like literally the platform upon which we stand. Because like the program for a revolution in the United States and on a world scale, like that is still to be developed and articulated and brought into being. And ultimately it's the masses of oppressed and exploited people that are going to build a new world, not us. Like not some collective, writing this book, not, that's not where it's going to come from. So certainly we hope to, inspire critical thinking about the imperialist world system and alternatives to it, to inspire militancy and to inspire, fighters, people to organize and to resist the system and to ultimately overturn it and build a better world, but not a blueprint. So framework, platform, whatever, those are cool.
Framework. My bad.
No, that's good. And I think it's important for us to like tease these concepts out and be, and that's kind of what this was an experiment in, was trying to be really precise about some things that are much more, that are often like more flimsy.
Yeah.
And to go into more detail around questions of like, okay, like what are some of the core characteristics, the guiding principles, and even structural and institutional features of the society that we desire. And I mean, we say absolutely it's communism, right? For Marx and Engels, they described communism as a free association of social individuals, or the free association of free and equal producers. There's a variety of different descriptions that they provided of it as a goal, as well as a process, right? And that's one of the hard things to get, is communism is both like a vision of alternative social organization, like a goal to aspire towards, but it also reveals itself in the actual lived struggles today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think framework is the word that I was thinking of, but I've been saying blueprint for some reason, but I'm very glad for that clarification. I do think that like the usage and the appropriate usage of language is very key. This book introduced me to a lot of concepts that when I first read it kind of didn't really stick with me. And then when I revisited the book, I was like, holy shit, this book is like, it's really dense. It's really, really dense. So, and I think that a large part of the inability to notice these concepts at first is due to a lot of Red Scare propaganda that's been effective for squashing leftist movements for the past century, maybe. But one of the things that stuck out to me was historical materialism and crisis theory. I, for the past few weeks, or in whatever conversations I've had with friends, have tried to convey this idea that everything is connected in politics, in society, and so on and so forth. How do you, what was your approach with discussing those kind of theories in this book? How crucial were they? And was it difficult to really like put them in a condensed form?
Yeah. To speak first to the question of like Red Scare propaganda, I mean, that's like institutionally embedded in.
It's like second nature for a lot of just people, politicians, business, just everyone. Is just communism is a red flag itself. The minute you hear somebody say it, you think dictatorship and like brutality.
It
But
doesn't even make sense sometimes. Like Russia is still communist, but we openly accuse the Russian oligarchs of stealing the election. Like, do you like understand what you're saying? Or
Yeah, in the intro to the book, we cite Herbert Marcuse, who is one of the like Frankfurt School Marxists, who said, our present civilization has to defend itself against the specter of a world which could be free. And he sort of talked about preventative counter-revolution. And there's been multiple Red Scares in the United States, right? Like you go back to the origins of International Workers' Day, May Day, May 1st, right? That goes back to Chicago, Haymarket Square in 1886. And you look at the propaganda that was used by the ruling class against the workers' movement, against socialist and anarchist forces. You look at, turn of the century through to World War I, the Red Scare against first the industrial workers of the world, or the IWW, and the Socialist Party, and then against the Communist Party, and then, again in the 50s and 60s against the Black Liberation Movement and against the New Left. And so, anti-communism runs deep in the United States and is like a key factor of stifling critical thinking, of preventing our movements from breaking free of the two-party, capitalist system. And, you see it in so many different ways, to such an extent that communism becomes everything and nothing, right? It's like undefinable. It's just like, Russia is communist, China is communist. And it's like, there's no actual description usually of what a communist society actually is, and is often used as a synonym for like tyranny or something like that, which is so untrue. And it's like, there's that Malcolm X quote about how, our oppressors will have us, siding, our oppressors will have us like siding with the people we should be fighting, right? And then fighting the people we should be siding with. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
There's also, people don't really, people don't understand the lengths at which the FBI went to split up these movements. It wasn't just like, oh, we're gonna ban you talking about communism. It was, they would infiltrate these groups, they would split them up based on ideas of like white chauvinism and stuff like that. And it's kind of reinvented now in like leftist circles. Like there are some leftists that are completely anti-identity politics. There are some that are pro-identity politics. It's kind of a weird split, but like that has been the MO for quite some time, is to get into these orgs, sow division, follow the leaders home, find their addresses, whatever. And I don't think that that's really something that gets spoken about enough. And I think that it really does attribute to the splits today.
Yeah, and it's, you have a long history of the systematic destruction of revolutionary movements in this country, and that goes. You could go all the way back, right, to the settler colonial origins of this country and the destruction of indigenous resistance movements, the destruction of African resistance movements, the repression of abolitionists. It goes deep, and these things are connected. And that's what a state is, right? That's what the imperial state does. It's a giant apparatus, not only for sort of like making sure that the capitalist economy is running fine, but it's also a weapon of political repression, ideological indoctrination.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about this book too, well, there's so many things honestly, but I mentioned the BRU already, but there's a quote in here that struck me, and it was social investigation is an active part and catalyst in the process of an organization. And I don't know if I have the exact quote over here, but I think it emphasized that social research and like political research should not be should not, like social research should be political and not apolitical, because that is integral to a society. Like that's why we have like a civil rights movement, because there are classes and races and groups of people that are not given the same rights as others. So I want to commend you for putting that in there, because that blew my mind. But also I think that's another thing that is not really adequately spoken about. Like I think identity politics is either too far in one direction. It's either and it yeah, I think that there is a way to, you know, productively talk about the middle ground. I just don't think that it's done in an effective manner. But I think that this book kind of did it in a very cohesive and like concise way.
One of the things that we were trying to do, and I don't know if we accomplished this goal, but certainly something we were trying to do, is reconcile these two poles that I think you've spoken to already a few times, the tension between class politics and identity politics. There are other ways to frame it. And, you know, what we've been trying to emphasize is that, look, like, you know, the whole system, which we call the imperialist world system, is an amalgam of capital, colonialism, specifically, you know, white supremacist settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and the state. And these things don't exist as separate entities, right? That would actually be like an element of our critique of certain forms of intersectional thinking, right? These aren't separate things that intersect. They're actually, you know, accommodating to, co-defining, and reproducing one another in a very dynamic and complex way. And that's the task of historical materialist research, or as we call it, you know, historical geographical materialist research, because in line with the science of our day, you know, time and space are not separate, right? And we need to think very carefully about history and geography and how they overlay with one another, and how our whole material reality is constituted, you know, through a multiplicity of struggles. It's not, you know, it's a useful heuristic to think about bourgeoisie versus proletariat. And that is one of the central contradictions that defines our society. But it's not the only one.
Right.
We can think about struggles for women's liberation, struggles for trans liberation, struggles for Black and Indigenous liberation, environmental struggles. There's a variety of different struggles that are part of that terrain that we need to account for. And so social investigation is like the tool that we need to hone and develop. And it's what down here in Richmond, Virginia, where I am, you know, it's what comrades with the Richmond Tenants Union did when they first started their work. Was, you know, they said, we're not going to go out and like tell people what the issues are. We're going to go out and we're going to make conversation with people. We're going to listen to what they have to say, and, you know, base our political programs, our actions that we're going to take, we're going to base that on the investigations we conduct, right? The results of the research process. And so really we wanted to embed social scientific research methods into a political project. That's sort of goal one, which is what we talk about in the first chapter, The Weapon of Theory.
That's kind of that's what like that's something that I've been noticing lately too, is that anytime I speak politics with people, I tend to speak a lot about politics, but even with people that don't agree with me, I find that like over time, if I keep having these same conversations with people, you know, it tends to be more productive later on. Like I can have a conversation with somebody, we'll fight, we'll vehemently disagree, but the more time goes on and the more we talk, it's weird how like you kind of come together, but that's a crucial part of organizing. And I think that that's also something that I'm learning too, that I hadn't really understood. Like when you talk politics, you are pitching a framework essentially. And I think that that's a very difficult thing to do, because you have to approach people sensitively, you know, it's not really their fault that their worldview is set up the way that it is, until it's like blatantly obvious that they're, that they're whatever is wrong with them. But like you are pitching a framework, and you have to make it palatable, interesting, and equitable. And I think that that's something that organizing for autonomy does really well. And so I feel like I can kind of get the organizing experience from this book, because it's not really, there's no emphasis on specific evils. It's more so, this is how society works, and this is how we can like circumvent it.
Right. And I think, as sympathetic as I may be to, in literature, good versus evil narratives, that's not what communist politics is about, right? Mm-hmm. It is about, and I mean, depending on whose sort of standpoint we're operating from,
right.
You could say, I mean, depending on your definition of evil, I certainly think, the mass pauperization and impoverishment of peoples the world over, the dispossession of indigenous nations, the legacies of slavery and ongoing super exploitation of peoples all over the world, like that's evil. That's some evil ass shit. Like, but it's not, that doesn't really explain much. Right. And like, what we're trying to do is develop a more holistic and integral, social science framework grounded in historical materialism, but also integrating newer insights from intersectional feminism, systems theory, ecology, and those lines of thinking. But yeah, and to go back to the first thing you said, Sal, about communication, like the organizer has to learn to communicate and to like synthesize people's lived experiences. And that's like a thing that only develops through practice.
Yeah.
Well, for me, the book was really like appealing for me because I'm more of a person who like, my mind and head is like for DC and like Washington politics and like what bill is being approved and what's in the bill and what does that bill mean for like my class of people. So it's like this was like a good like summation of all the theories that I need to have, and like I could like revert back to where I could like try to where I'm trying to convert people into like socialism and communism and like change like the vantage point that they have in like this American society and this hegemonic state. And in chapter 2, you say that the hegemonic state will continue to reproduce not just internally but throughout the world unless we abolish the institutional basis of their power. And I'm like, and I want to ask, like, what levers of power are available to us right now as labor? Like, obviously, we're not going to talk about any elections because that's just like, that's a farce now. And unionizing could do so much because that kind of intertwines with like
Taft-Hartley Act, baby.
Yeah, that kind of intertwines with politics. So yeah, just what levers of power do you think that we have available to us now, and in the future, what you answer to, how much will it be in the future?
Sure. That's a great question. And thinking about the first part, when you're saying the necessity of like winning people over to like a communist program, for example, and that's certainly like a part of the organizer's task. But the organizer also has to get people to recognize like, yo, like you live these contradictions. Like you, like if you're a worker, you are exploited, and coming to see the relations between the worker and the boss, right? And to see the power that's latent in the workplace, right? And through the social bonds that workers have, the social connections that capital actually creates the world over, that we're connected to people in very disparate geographic regions. And if we could sort of hack that, right? Learn to communicate, cooperate, and coordinate our efforts across multiple fronts, like we can shut this whole system down. And I mean, that's just like Marxism 101, right? That's like the workers movement 101, that you know, workers that organized at the point of production can shut things down, if they're organized, right? But in terms of like the power that we have to like challenge, the state, and it's not going to be enough just to unionize your workplace, right? There will be, if there's going to be a social revolution, there's going to be a struggle between the masses of oppressed and exploited people organized as a revolutionary movement against a reactionary, counter-revolutionary state that's going to, use every weapon at its disposal to prevent the revolutionary transformation of the world. And so in terms of the weapons we have at our disposal, in the last chapter of the book, we attempt to outline some of them using historical reference points. And I believe there are 4 such weapons we identify. First, are autonomous mass organizations, or what we call organs of counterpower, right? That includes everything from rank and file, militant anti-capitalist labor unions, to workers' councils, to popular assemblies, to women's liberation organizations, to trans liberation organizations, to Black liberation organizations, right? They're popular organizations that are created usually around a specific set of concerns or a specific site of struggle, right? So the organization in the workplace, the organization in the neighborhood, the organization in the prison, the organization in the military, right? You have these mass organizations that are created by people to, either resist, say, exploitation at their place of work, or to address a particular like social issue, like pollution, for example. The second such organization are what we call people's defense organizations. You could also go back to the tradition of like revolutionary militias or self-defense formations. Reality is, like, our movements are going to have the capacity to defend themselves against not only the state, but also fascist paramilitaries and other such forces that are going to do everything they can to crush our movement. Third weapon was what we call a party of autonomy, revolutionary party organization, which is just like a synonym for communist political organization. I think we have our own spin on that, but which we could talk about. And then the fourth is a united front. Got to bring all these things together, right?
Yeah.
Got to have unions and community organizations united with the defense organizations and the revolutionary party organizations. And if you can bring them all together into a coherent network, it's, populated by masses of workers and oppressed people, and it's geographically dispersed at sort of key strategic nodal points throughout the system, then that's what gives us that power. And so I think the task is we got to start building that, right? And that's what we're trying to do through our work in tenants unions and labor unions and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the cadre party that you mentioned in your book. With the most recent election win of the MAS party in Bolivia, congratulations, guys. And in comparison with the United States elections, yeah, finally, like, Jesus Christ. How can we like maneuver in having a cadre party that's devoid of credentialism and like co-opting even from like the most well-meaning of people, like the quote-unquote progressives that we have in the Democratic Party? Like, I'm guessing their politics reflects ours somewhat, but they're still sheep herding people into that Democratic Party. And it seems that, like, I read somewhere that even in this election that the MAS party actually gained a worker who she literally she sells juice in the street, and now she's a senator. And I feel that in the United States that would never happen. Like, we have, like, even in our most progressive of representatives, they're still college educated or they have master's degrees, and like they don't really like they do. I mean, they reflect our wants, but I don't think they reflect us in their like purest sense. And like, I think that the only one person I think in Congress that does is Cori Bush, and it's because that she was unemployed. She doesn't have health insurance. She actually reflects like the median member of the working class party, not working, but the working class in the United States, period. So how do we like avoid those pitfalls from happening?
Well, the first is a clarification, which is that when we're talking about, a revolutionary party, we're not necessarily talking about a party that even participates in elections at all, right? I do think that the Latin American experience is really important for us to study. For example, MAS in Bolivia, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, and just generally, we should definitely study like what have there been historical instances in which revolutionaries have effectively utilized the electoral terrain to build people power, right? But the goal is to build people power, not take over the existing state apparatus, if that's what one aims, what one's going to do with electoral work. But when we're talking about a revolutionary party, we're really talking about more, a cadre organization, an organization of revolutionary militants that are embedded in the trenches of social struggle. So these are people working in labor unions and tenant unions, in community organizations, hopefully agitating in prisons and in the military to break those institutions. And so that's like what we're talking about a revolutionary party. But the pull of the state machine in this country is huge, right? And we see it, the election cycle and the just the power that it has over the people's imagination, and that it draws people in and it sucks away, revolutionary energy, right? Like the Democratic Party is the graveyard for revolutionary movements. I've heard people describe it as the place where the left goes to die, right? And
Shit, that sure is
Kashama
true.
Sawant said that.
It's like I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that really we need to be thinking about what is like an independent proletarian and people's power look like, and what would we need to do to begin building that today. And I think there are, so like for us, the Revolutionary Party is one means through which preventing that assimilation into the system, right? Mm-hmm. So like CounterPower, as well as organizations like Unity and Struggle, Red Bloom Communist Collective. There's a lot of different groups throughout the country that are not constructing themselves as like electoral vehicles, right? But are seeking to build the independent power of working class and oppressed people. And so it's like a political home, right? Like a cadre organization. I mean, it's interesting. The word cadre, if I'm not mistaken, is of French origin and literally means framework, right? So it's an organization that provides its militants, its members, with a framework to conduct their work, and also a space for the critical assessment of the results of our work, right? To assess our progress, to see how we're doing. And I mean, that's like what we do through CounterPower is like, in our local branches, we're constantly assessing, how is our work unfolding? What difficulties are we encountering? How can we troubleshoot them? All with the political aim of how can we strengthen, our incipient communist movement? How can we strengthen sort of the tendencies that emerge organically from people's struggles that embody like a future alternative, to nurture them and to protect them and to do, whatever we can to resist them being assimilated into for example, the Democratic Party machine. And all that's not to discount like very real political shifts that are happening also in the electoral arena as well, which are having an effect on people's consciousness, their ideas, how open they are to revolutionary theory and practice, right?
Yeah. I mean, this quote in the book kind of sums it up really nicely. It's the revolution has to be a movement in every sense of the word. If it cannot move within, across, and through the different spheres, it'll ultimately go nowhere at all. And I think that's, I mean, what else can you say about that? It's true. I mean, all of these components will, as we are building for a counterpower, there is a counterpower to our counterpower. And you speak about the rise of fascism and how that comes about. You speak about the rise of neoliberalism, which this is a direct quote from the book, and it obscures crises with multiculturalism. And like, I feel like you can kind of see that today, whereas a lot of black leadership or black celebrities kind of in a counterproductive way will, you know, advocate for certain things that are a detriment to their community, or like a lot of people will fall into the pitfall of like, black entrepreneurship is the answer, which it's not. And then that's one aspect. Then you have the rise of fascism that counters, I mean, socialist movements. I mean, it's, you look in the street, there's Nazi protesters along with fucking Black Lives Matter protesters, and you know, that's a whole thing. And I mean, yeah, I think that there is a level of there's a level of like militancy that is necessary, but also there is it's very easy to get thrown off track when you're trying to build a counter movement, because there's so many components and there's so many things to keep track of that it's not like there's one method to really do it. There's not one answer to these questions, and there's a multitude of things you can do and a multitude of ways you can organize, but they all have to happen either in tandem, or you have to know who's on your side and who isn't.
And it comes down to having a framework for conducting, you know, materialist social scientific research, right? That's one aspect. Being able to see the connections between struggles against pipelines that will destroy, you know, indigenous communities.
Yeah.
With the struggle for Black lives against racist policing and racist prisons, right? With the workers' struggles, you know, at Amazon, or you know, in the sphere of social reproduction, whether that's nurses or teachers, and grasping these very diverse struggles in their mutual relations, right? That they're interdependent. And so then that's why social investigation is important, right? If you can recognize, okay, there's going to be connections between these struggles, or connections that could be made. How do we do that? And that's the importance of conducting social investigations inside these struggles, right? And, you know, giving voice to the people themselves. And then the other aspect is developing our capacities for strategic thinking, which like are in their infancy, right? And the development of our capacities for strategic thinking is contingent on our analysis of the system, our vision of an alternative, right? And some idea of what that struggle is going to look like. Like if you think that you can just take over the imperialist state apparatus through some sweeping, you know, electoral victory, I mean, that's going to dictate a certain series of tactics that are aligned with that strategy. It's not going to happen that you're just going to like take over the existing state apparatus through like the Democratic Party, for example. Like, you know, the Lord said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Like, we should all take that to heart, because like, you know, that electoral machine is not designed to serve the needs of working class and oppressed people.
Yeah, so stop talking about Biden versus Trump. Sick of it.
A machinery for domination and exploitation. And so what we should be talking about is, how do we build our own power, right? What we call counterpower. But how do we build our own power, the power of the people and the power of the oppressed, both to shatter this existing system and to transcend it, to build something different, to build an alternative that's, you know, a classless, stateless, decolonized, feminist, and ecological society, which we simply call communism.
How would you say prison abolition ties into this? Because I thought when I started reading about prison abolition, I kind of feel like it started my push towards more communist ideology, because that's when I started realizing how much of things were connected in American politics. So, and I know that I believe there's a section in the book that discusses prison abolition too, with like community self-defense and stuff like that. So how does that look like according to the book?
Yeah. I mean, great question, because prison abolition is like a really hot issue right now, as it should be.
Yeah.
Prisons are, institutions of settler colonial white supremacist domination. I mean, one of the primary functions of prisons in the United States, and the reason we have such a big prison population, and the reason the prison population is disproportionately Black, is because it was a weapon of counterinsurgency, right? The war on drugs and the development of the prison industrial complex comes directly out of the repression against the Black liberation struggle in the 1960s and 70s. So when we're talking about, say, prison abolition, we're talking about the abolition of a society that needs prisons, right? We're not talking about the abolition of like institutions of justice or the need for conflict resolution and adjudication, but that's not what prisons do in our society, right? Warehousing a certain section of the population. They are razor wire plantations for the proletariat in this country. And so, yeah, I mean, abolish prisons, abolish ICE concentration camps, and abolish the police. Like, that's got to be part of the communist movement's program. In terms of like how that's accomplished, I mean, that's like a more complex issue. I think certainly, freedom, as I think George Jackson said it. George Jackson was a member of the Black Panther Party, prison organizer, was executed by the state. And George Jackson, I think, said, all prisoners are political prisoners, right? And I think the Black Panthers, this was something that they expressed repeatedly, because they're like, to be a colonized subject in the U.S. empire, you don't get a fair trial. You don't get a trial of your own peers, right? So these are weapons of counterinsurgency, and we should approach them as such. And instead, people approach it like, oh, but like, what's going to happen? What about crime and all of these things? Like, most crime is social to begin with, right? You're talking about a system that, through its normal workings, through its normal machinations, produces people that are impoverished, that don't have enough to eat, that don't have a roof over their heads, that are degraded and beaten and exploited at every turn. So, that society needs prisons. It's an integral component to its normal functioning and reproduction. A communist society in which the masses of people have control over the resources that they're dependent on, they have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, in which there are community institutions that are controlled by the people who live in that community. You don't need prisons. And now there is the question, there's always a thorny question. What about the counter-revolution? Right. And I think that there's a qualitative difference between a society that organizes itself around mass incarceration, around the prison system, and a revolutionary society that has to take means into its own hands to defend itself against reactionaries and against terrorism coming from fascist paramilitaries, against the remnants of the state apparatus. But those are temporary measures. It's very different than institutionalizing a prison system and a system of policing that is designed to keep Black, Indigenous, and Latinx peoples at the bottom of society, right? To keep the proletariat at the bottom of society. So, I mean, in terms of some of the institutions we outline, we say building the commune, as we talk about as an alternative to the imperial state, right? One of the core institutions of the commune is what we call the council. It's people's assemblies, right? So we're talking about workers' councils at the point of production and neighborhood councils in the community. And that sort of spinning off from these councils, you could have a variety of different working committees, defense and security committees that are actually created by, accountable to, and recallable by, right, the people that created them. So sort of debureaucratizing society, decarcerating society, and putting power back into the hands of the people. And that's what communism is all about.
I feel like that would have been something that I feel like there hasn't been any indication more now that we need something like that, because I remember distinctly, I think 4 years ago, there was a gentleman in Bushwick. He was mentally ill. I'm not sure exactly what his condition was, but he was known in the community, and he would regularly have like a faucet or something like that on him, and he would just be out in the streets or whatever, and somebody called the police on him. The police came in, emptied I think like 40 rounds into him or something like that. And it's just like, the only thing I said on my Facebook was like, I really feel like they did not need to kill this man. And so many people were just like, well, what did you want them to do? They thought it was a gun. And it's like, but literally every person in this neighborhood knows this dude, knows he's not a threat, and knew it wasn't a gun. You're telling me the people that we pay for protection couldn't discern, couldn't ask, couldn't do anything, and the best thing they could do was fucking kill him? So it's like, I think when we talk about policing, people are so averse to prison abolition because they think that police keep communities safe. They think that crime will just go up and up and up. And I mean, we've seen a crime spike in New York. I mean, I don't know how much of it I believe. I'm sure there's a good chunk of it that's propaganda. But I mean, I don't necessarily think that. I feel like if cops kept shit safe, I don't know, $7 billion, you could probably do a better job. But also, it's kind of proof that it doesn't work. So I feel like setting up these community facilities would kind of subvert that. It's like, oh, we're going to call in the community defense because this guy is disturbing people, whatever the case is. Just beware. He has a condition. He's known to do this and that. And like, try not to use lethal force. Like it's like, is that so fucking insane for people to grasp? Like, is that really utopian?
Well, that's the importance of, so first of all, there's so many, so much great research that's been done, and a lot of good writings on the subject of police and prison abolition, and exploring, the social roots, the historical roots of the police, right? The police come out of the systems of, slavery, right?
Yep.
Slave catchers. You have the systems of organized political repression of the workers' movement, right? Pinkerton thugs. I mean, this is all, at least in the left, I feel like this is widely understood and well known, right? That like the police are a repressive institution. Their primary function is to defend property and to defend and reproduce the existing system. And they do that with violence, right? And
they have a monopoly on violence.
Yeah, did you see there was an incident in Rhode Island? I don't know when it happened, but I just saw the video today of Jamal Gonzalez. These cops just drove right. He's on a moped and they fucking slammed into this kid. He's in critical condition. It's like, what the fuck? Why is that okay?
And until we have the courage to say we need our own communal defense and security systems that are not police, right? We're talking about going back to, the workers' movement, even some of the more reformist wings of the workers' movement were not afraid to raise the question of like the workers' militia, for example, and understood very clearly that like the ruling class are not going without a fight. And we also have to take care of our own interests in our own way, right? Mm-hmm. And the methods that the communist movement should use have to be qualitatively different from those that the ruling class uses, right?
Right.
And that I think that there's a lot of like fruitful avenues for further research and envisioning and implementation in terms of thinking about, well, what would like communal restorative justice and conflict resolution look like? What can we learn from revolutionary movements internationally, from, the Kurdish freedom struggle to the Zapatistas and Chiapas, to maybe even further back, going to, the experience of the Chinese Revolution, Cuban Revolution, right? Looking at all of these historical experiences of revolutionary struggle in which masses of people attempted to do things differently, right? What would communal defense and security look like in the context of abundance and people's control over social production and reproduction?
Hopefully like Rojava.
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting things going on there for sure. And they have, and I think actually in this specific section, on communal defense and security in organizing for autonomy, we draw from some of the experience of the Rojava revolution. because they've attempted to build an alternative to policing in prisons, not totally successfully. This is what I was going back to with that question of what do you do with the counter-revolutionaries, right? They're fighting the Islamic State, and they have, like this tension between, okay, how do we deal with contradictions among the people, right? What would sort of restorative justice practices look like among the people? But then what happens with the sort of fascist forces of the Islamic State that have picked up arms and have terrorized and brutalized and murdered, Kurdish peoples in the region? And so, I mean,
also Turkey.
Absolutely. Oh, and then face absolutely. I mean, I was thinking, they're dealing with this problem, years ago, and now today they're also facing the reality of, Turkish fascism, or, regional imperialism, and the repression against the Kurdish freedom movement, both internal to Turkey and in the surrounding regions by the Turkish state. It's really brutal.
One of the mind-blowing parts in this book that you cited, William Reich, I'm not sure if I'm Wilhelm Reich, about how family structure is a way to condition individuals into authoritarian social systems. And if these like social systems are embedded in us like since birth, how am I going to like?
Yeah, fight your family, bro. Not physically, but like you just gotta be like me. Just challenge them on everything, and then
not my family. They're already damned. But I'm talking about other people, like other people to say that like these things that you experience are from up top, because especially for the last 5 years, I think that everyone has internalized just beating down labor, and just like whether it's through, I personally think that it coincides with the rise of Bernie Sanders, but how do you counter that force that's so strong that like you see it it begins in your household and ends in the workplace, or continues in the workplace, and then it just like keeps being cyclical?
Yeah, no, that's and for those who don't know, Wilhelm Reich was like an interesting character in the history of both Marxism and psychology. He
completely said that wrong.
Was one of the he's one of the early sort of one of the early thinkers in the attempt to synthesize like Marxism with Freudian psychoanalysis. And I'm definitely a fan of like some of his earlier work. He goes a little off the deep end with some of his later theories. Orgone energy, if anyone wants to look it up. He had some pretty out there ideas. One of the points he makes that I think, Anthony, you were just making, that's like, I think sound, is how the family reproduces, the family represses certain social behaviors that are, not aligned with the existing social system, right? So we see how Reich was looking at sexual repression in the family in particular, right? And how that sort of primed people for submission later in life, whether that was in the workplace or to the state. And he talks about sort of the submission of people to the authoritarian miniature state in the family as a precursor to our submission to the authoritarian capitalist state at the societal level. But that's where, like, I think, for one, feminist politics become really important, in the sense that the transformation of intimate social relations is one of the ways we can militate against that. And the construction of new forms of care and intimacy and new ways of being together, right? They're really important, I think, while we're building the institutional capacity to actually challenge the system as a whole, right? So combining sort of the macro challenge to this system in the form of, a revolutionary workers' movement organized into militant, labor unions and workers' councils, and uniting sort of those bigger efforts with some of the more micro efforts to create a new culture and a new way of being, and what would communal childcare and education and healthcare and these sort of questions look like, and how could they, instead of stifling, critical thinking, rebellious impulses, how could they foster them and nurture them?
Yeah, that reminds me of a women's labor movement, I believe in the early 1900s, where a lot of the movement came from the fact that men were fighting for their rights at work, and then women were like, we need our rights too, because the men are successful, but like we're still getting abused. Like our lives are different than men, so we need to fight for basically a different fight. And it was also then they were also trying to push the idea like we also have housework, so there's a whole like literal work culture at home that we suffer under, and then we go to our actual jobs and suffer under that too. And that's like I feel like that's connected to this in a sense where like it's not like politics or these systems of control or oppression or whatever have you only present themselves when you're out in the world. They present themselves in all forms of life.
Absolutely. And I mean, we draw inspiration from that. And, at one point, I think it's here in the last chapter, Building the Commune, where we talk about, simultaneous to building proletarian counterpower at the point of social production, the revolutionary movement has to build feminist counterpower at the point of social reproduction. We have to build institutions of communal care and to collectivize certain functions, whether that's through communal kitchens and childcare facilities, new types of educational institutions, and creative ways of finding ways to de-alienate and collectivize, the functions that are historically gendered, right?
Right.
And that's also the importance of supporting like autonomous liberation struggles, right? There's not just going to be the labor struggle, right? There's going to be women's liberation struggles, trans feminist liberation struggles, Black and Indigenous liberation struggles, environmental struggles. And that the question is, how can we put these different fronts, really, because they're different fronts in one war, right? Mm-hmm. How can we connect them into a unified strategy?
I think because of the long periods of oppression that those specific groups have gone through, it does make them susceptible to like more capitalistic ideas that like for me, I'm a Black man. I need my 40 acres and a mule. I need my reparations. I need to be a part of the Forbes list in order to like keep track with all the other racial hierarchies before me. And I wanted to know like, how do you appeal to those type of people who think that I'm kind of sympathetic to that point where it's like, hey, I see Jay-Z and Barack Obama reach these cultural and political heights that I also want to attain. And now you're asking me to be more egalitarian. And I also feel on that, but I want to make it for myself. So all those individualistic goals, like how do you subside like everyday human ego from this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it affects a lot of sectors of society, not only the historically oppressed and marginalized, but that's a question I deal with as an education worker, right? Like a lot of the line in a lot of U.S. public education institutions is everyone should aspire to be like an entrepreneur, right? And this sort of neoliberal ideal of the individual as like the entrepreneur. And, most of us will end up as workers, right? That's how this system works. Most of us won't be entrepreneurs. Most of us will sell our capacity to work to capital. in return for a wage. In fact, in return for a wage, if we're lucky for many people, right? I mean, that's the other side. So I think getting people to see that reality is like part of it, and coming to terms with like, it's okay to be a worker, right? In fact, there's power in the working class if we can get organized. And that I think in terms of aspirations, like, of course people aspire to get more, especially if they don't have anything, if they have less, or they see, and I mean, you can't totally fault people for wanting to pursue that in the absence of an alternative, right? We don't have a strong revolutionary movement in this country. We don't have many recent examples of liberated societies that we could point to as a beacon of hope to inspire people to fight. Because it hasn't always been this way, right? Like the sort of like celebrity entrepreneur type thing, it hasn't always been around, and it's like a relative, I mean, there's been versions of it, right? Celebrities have been around for some time in the 20th century and are a key part of the sort of ideological state apparatus of the imperialist system, right? It's an aspirational ideal. People see a celebrity and they become the people they look up to, rather than identifying the power that rests within themselves and in their community to, improve their situation. Instead, we aspire to become, some famous musician, TV star, whatever it might be.
Do you think that we should counter that? Like Michael Brooks, he came up with an idea of cosmopolitan. I don't know if you could use that in a verb, but you could like make a mainstream line of making socialism cool, where it's like, instead of just like, hey, instead of going to the movies to see the latest Marvel flick, you go to a like rally. You go to a IWW rally if you're on the weekend. Like, I wonder if that could be like harnessed into one person, and we like use some of their tactics of like how you use that personal celebrity to like market things for capitalistic gains, instead of use that and do it for socialist gains or communist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly all for turning the weapons of the ruling class back on themselves and by any means necessary, and think that, like, for example, utilization of media, whether that's in the form of podcasts or film, music, right? Like, those are important cultural weapons in the struggle to change society. But I think I caution sometimes. I mean, first of all, I think communism is cool. So that's like, so communism is cool, kids.
Yeah. Mao wrote a book
Commune.
called Combat Liberalism, and that shit was fire. So I definitely recommend checking it out because I liked it a lot.
Combat liberalism is fire,
It's
for
so
sure.
good.
And it's concise and a great text. But this question of like, I mean, I do like the idea of, I think Lenin said that revolutions are festivals of the oppressed, right? And like, we should embrace that.
All these leaders have the coolest lines. Oh my God. I need to start writing.
Do have some good hot takes for sure. And, we should embrace like that festival of the oppressed. We should totally, and that's like part of our history, as in terms of the communist movement and the workers movement. Part of our history was like, if you read about the era of the Haymarket martyrs in the 1880s in Chicago, and like the sort of ecosystem that they had of just like parties and picnics and festivals and like these fiery rallies and speakers and debates and, reading clubs and all these organizations, like, and similar things in the 20th century, where you just had this buzzing of activity, right? Bike riding clubs and like choruses and things that seem rather mundane, but we're part of this counter society, right? Of this other society that the revolutionary movement built and was linked to a certain theory of social development, of a vision of an alternative, and a strategic orientation for overturning the existing order. And we should absolutely, and that, I think a lot of people crave that. I don't know. I mean, I crave that. Like, I want community and communality. I want to and especially now, right? Like, I think when
during COVID, when we're all deprived of social interaction.
Finding ways to create those meaningful forms of social interaction in the context of the pandemic is certainly a challenge. And there's a lot of comrades who have been creatively trying to keep the flame of sociality alive, even as many of us are quarantined in our homes or forced back to work because we're essential workers. And that's a difficult context, but one that a revolutionary movement could nonetheless revive forms of communality, of festivities.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wanted to ask this. So a lot of people are skeptical of communism because they hear things like, oh, well, Mao killed 900 million people and Stalin killed 400 billion people. And they hear these overinflated numbers, and there is a need to be objective about it, because it's not like all of these leaders were completely innocent, much like any leader. I'm not too familiar with a lot of Fidel Castro's regime, but I've heard some things. So with that said, and especially with someone like Vladimir Lenin, who kind of, I don't know if advanced is the right word, but I maybe militarized Marxism with State and Revolution. And Vladimir Lenin was kind of in my eyes, was like a pragmatist and an opportunist. And Noam Chomsky has been particularly hard on him, harder on Mao, hard on Stalin, and has been more in favor of someone like
Trotsky.
I'm not sure what he thinks of Trotsky, but he's been
He
more
likes Trotsky.
Oh, really? He's been more in favor of a Rosa Luxemburg type, at least to my knowledge. But what would you say to people that are kind of turned off by communism because of the misconceptions and the misinformation that's out there? And what context do you think that people should study these communist revolutions?
That's a big question and a difficult question to answer. I think first of all is the deification of revolutionary leaders is not a good thing. We should, throw the cult of personality into the trash can of history. And, so the tradition that Chomsky sort of comes out of and that you're referring to sort of spans the anarcho-communist and anarcho-syndicalist tradition exemplified in the National Confederation of Labor, or CNT, in Spain, as well as the Council Communist tradition, which came more out of the Dutch and German left. And these tendencies were, very critical of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, and then the subsequent regimes in, say, China or Cuba. And I think it's important for us to engage with those traditions. I mean, certainly in Organizing for Autonomy, you'll see that we owe a tremendous debt to elements of those traditions. But then we also cite Rudolf Rocker, an anarcho-syndicalist, alongside Lenin, right? Because both of them were saying that labor unions are schools of communism, right? It's where workers learn to govern themselves. We also cite, Mao, because Mao had a tremendous amount to say about social investigation and the importance of investigating the concrete situation in order to formulate a political strategy and to adopt the appropriate political tactics to actualize that strategy, right, to win. And so we have a lot to learn from both traditions. And I think that enough historical time has passed, both since, say, the Russian Revolution and the fall of the Soviet Union, that we need to assess both of those traditions critically, because the reality is neither of them were successful in winning a world revolutionary transformation. We are still living under the boot of imperialism, and therefore, CounterPower's attitude is any weapon that can be furnished to fight this system is fair game. And we have a lot to learn from Marx and Engels and Lenin and Mao and Trotsky and Fidel and Che. We also have a lot to learn from Rosa Luxemburg, or lesser known names like Anton Pannekoek or Paul Matic or Alexandra
Jacques Dessalines.
Jay Posadas.
I mean, for sure, like we should embrace the whole revolutionary tradition from a critical and scientific standpoint. And some people will dismiss this as eclecticism. Some people don't like it when you break with tradition, right? The warm arm of orthodoxy is like a comforting thing. Anyone who has, gone through more traditional religious institutions is aware of this phenomenon. And we don't want to replicate those aspects of religious institutions. We want to develop a critical and scientific approach to revolutionary struggle, and therefore, and historical materialism, right? We should assess the actual history, not the state-sanctioned ideological histories. And I'm not saying there's nothing to learn from those either, right? Like there's plenty to learn from research produced in the Soviet Union or People's Republic of China at different periods, especially during sort of the peak of revolutionary struggle. But we should take a more holistic approach, I think, and that it's not without precedent. And it's like, we're not the first ones to propose that there needs to be some sort of reconciliation between the anti-authoritarian or anarchist left and, the Marxist or Marxist-Leninist left. And like people like Daniel Guerin proposed such syntheses, even in the history of the United States. If you go back, I've mentioned the Haymarket Martyrs a few times during this episode, but like the world of Haymarket in the 1880s was really interesting because they had this idea that was called the Chicago idea, or the Haymarket synthesis, where they were trying to sort of synthesize elements of Marxism and anarchism. And I don't know, I mean, I would say we should at least be open to such processes.
It's not really in line with anything that we've been talking about, but if Trotsky would have taken over Russia after Lenin instead of Stalin, do you think that it would have been a more thriving Russia?
That's a difficult question because, honestly, like, I don't think that I could provide an adequate answer to that question, but I will try to give a fragment. And here's my thinking is that in the Russian Revolution of 1917, you had this tremendous upsurge of, the Soviets, right? And Soviet is just a Russian word for council. It's where the idea of the council comes from, in part. So you had these big popular assemblies of workers. You also had factory committees that started organizing workers' control of production. And then you had, soldiers and peasants forming their own Soviets. And you just had this tremendous, upsurge of revolutionary activity among the working class and the peasantry. And, the Russian Revolution is born of that. Very quickly, the Bolsheviks and their ally, the left social revolutionary party, who at this point were in a coalition government together, they have like a falling out. There's a civil war that erupts. The Western imperialist countries invade Russia, and it's a terribly brutal civil war, right?
Fucking stressful.
and a lot of them thought they weren't even going to make it out of it, and that like the best they could do is provide an example like, what the Paris Commune served in the revolutionary imagination up until that point, right? It was a glimmer of hope, a sort of a vision to aspire to, but it ultimately failed, right? It was defeated through brute force, through the violent repression of the ruling class. And
That's what Trotsky actually advocated for in one of his pamphlets that he would send from Germany.
so Trotsky's whole, well, we'll get there because
Okay, so I'm sorry.
no, it's all good. The history of the Russian Revolution is just entangled with sort of the question of world revolution, and Trotsky and Lenin and many of the Bolsheviks believe that, look, if there isn't a revolution in Germany or Austria or Czechoslovakia or France, that like we're going to be encircled and crushed by the forces of imperialism. Like that was, and I mean,
Right.
a reasonable perspective, right?
Yeah.
And there was hope to believe that it didn't have to go that way, right? There was a revolution in Germany. There was a revolution in Hungary. In fact, a socialist Soviet republic was established in Hungary, I believe in 1919, if I'm not mistaken. There was insurrections all over Germany. There was the German Revolution of 1918. There were material reasons to believe that world revolution was around the corner, right? They're just coming out of World War I, tremendous devastation all over the world. People are revolting, and revolution is in the air. And so there was a real possibility that a world revolutionary wave could overtake the capitalist system. And that was why, the Russian revolutionaries in part felt we need to hold the line. We need to hold this down and be a beacon of hope. But it also led to very militarized ideas, right? To increasingly restricting people's freedoms, right? Like in terms of repression of anarchists, control of the press. You have these measures that are justified as emergency measures, but they later become more institutional features of Soviet society. And I think it's very easy for us to fall into simplistic readings of the situation, but I just wanted to paint a little bit of the picture of this is the world situation that they're dealing with, and they weren't, those decisions were made under extreme duress, right? So by the time the Civil War is over, there's a red victory against the whites in the Civil War, and there's some who would say, well, if only Trotsky had taken over, say, instead of Stalin or something like that. But that becomes a really difficult question to answer, because there had already been a lot of more authoritarian aspects of Soviet society that had begun to institutionalize. Certain aspects of the revolution had already begun to atrophy, and the sheer number of revolutionaries who were killed in the Civil War, meaning you had this whole layer of the working class that was highly self-educated, self-organized, and ready to sacrifice for the revolution, and a lot of them died in the Civil War. Wow. So you just had this working class that was decimated in a country that was primarily agrarian with a huge peasantry, and that creates a lot of things where I question whether the person at the top would make all the difference, though it probably would make some, to be real. I mean, not only do you not get an ideal person, you get Stalin, right? And it doesn't turn out so well.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, since Trotsky had a lot of critiques of Leninism, and he also had I think he had the foresight to see the problem in Germany and the rise of Nazism. So I think that it would have made, from the context of complete world history, I think it would have made things marginally better, but not too much. And it's just this, since you're the most educated and historical person that I know, I just had to ask.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think.
Look at all these books.
No.
Patrick, look at all these books. Own it.
It.
And also, I want to recommend you a movie, animated movie. It's called Superman Red Sun. You saw it? Or
No,
you?
I'm writing it down. I'll write it down.
Uh, it's basically if Superman grew up in
Russia instead of America.
yeah,
Yeah.
right after the Russian Revolution, and it's a pretty hard takedown of Stalinism, and sure, definitely watch that. I like it a lot. So
Yeah, you got homework, Patrick.
I'll check it out.
and tell me what you think.
I will. That'll be episode 2. We'll do a whole episode on Superman Red Sun. A deep dive.
Please, I'd love that.
It sounds sick, actually.
And I love, I do love like, historical what if questions. What if it wasn't Stalin that came out of those factional struggles in the Soviet Union? What if the anarcho-syndicalist revolution in Spain hadn't been defeated by both the Republic and fascism? These are all always interesting questions. What if the wave of anti-colonial revolutions had succeeded in just overtaking the entire imperial system in the 60s and 70s, right? And they're interesting questions to engage, but like we should also be sure to to study what actually happened in order to prepare for future scenarios, right? And to have and to draw our poetry from the future, right? To think about our revolution and making a stateless, classless society, if not in our lifetime, at least laying the foundations for a revolutionary movement that could win it in the future.
I think that organizing for autonomy is a very good framework for that reality, or hopefully a reality.
Maybe you should call it the counterpunch cadre. Shopping out ideas, man.
Yeah, you need to. You're working in the wrong industry, bro. You need to be a marketing
Counterpoint
engineer or some shit.
cadre.
All right, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the knowledge that you've dropped, and also for all the knowledge you've put into this book.
Just me. There was I don't know the total number of people who contributed to it, but there was, probably like 20 people contributed to this book in total.
Goddamn.
And in different ways, right? We had comrades who wrote parts of it, who helped with editing, who were also just part of, and more than that, were involved in the discussions that converged on the pages of this book. So, and as abstract or obtuse as certain parts of it I know can be, the theoretical and historical questions and strategic questions that we seek to deal with in this text come out of our actual organizing experiences. These are real questions that many of us have encountered with regards to, for example, the tension between class politics and identity politics, regarding the legacy of 20th century socialist societies, regarding the possibilities of a 21st century communist revolution, right? What would that look like? How would it differ from the revolutions that came before it? So, and thank you guys for having me on the podcast and for checking out the book. And now I guess if it's okay, I'll, the pitch, it's available from Common Notions, commonnotions.org. You can get it there, and you can check us out at counterpower.info. Shoot us an email, follow us on social media, and we're down to talk with anyone about this stuff. So
Yeah,
any comrades.
definitely.
A communal book written by a community. It's beautiful.
Patrick, thank you again so much, and hopefully we do have that Red Sun conversation. That would be pretty cool.
I'm down. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you got it, man. Take care.
Thank you. 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 Thank you.